Hello. Today I'm going to be discussing the epistemic systems present in the shaman. So the goal of this presentation is to examine the ways that both narrators, the father and the son, relate to history. How do they think that they know history? What kind of evidence do they use to support their claims? And what kind of claims do they ultimately arrive at? My hope is that by dissecting these two epistemic systems, we'll be able to gain some insight on the ultimate goal of the writer and the director. So the first step will be to understand the way that the father relates to history. Then it'll be to understand the way the son knows history and explore his epistemic system. Then we'll discuss the similarities and differences between the two systems or the two ways of knowing. And then finally, we'll reflect on what the writer and director were trying to say by putting these two characters in dialogue um, over historical footage. So, what is the father's epistemic system? Well, firstly, most of his knowledge comes from family anecdotes. He'll says a lot of the time things like "my parents told me," or he talks about his his uncle and his experiences in the Soviet Union. And this type of knowing is, of course, somewhat flawed. Anecdotes are not the best way to make wide claims about history because they have a small footprint. It's just one or two events as opposed to many events, which would give you a better understanding of history. Secondly, the father kind of has several broad beliefs about, quote, our country, or about fundamental beliefs about what it means to be Russian. Um, for instance, he says, the son asks, so we can't do without a great leader? Can't we decide things for ourselves? And the father says, in our country, no, it's not possible. We're not sure exactly why the father believes that, other than it's just sort of a fundamental belief that he feels history has proven to him again and again. Um, and then lastly, the father has a faith in authority, namely a faith in Stalin. And this could be the result of propaganda, of course. For instance, the father believes that the people are applauding Stalin's speeches because they believe in what he said, as opposed to, repression of any kind. Um, and he seems to have a whole different moral standards towards politicians and towards Stalin. He says you can't judge politicians by normal standards of morality. This demonstrates a certain faith in authority, which the father uses to interpret history. The son's epistemic system seems to be more based in scholarship, records, and the like. He often says, serious scholars claim or serious scholars believe. He says that, this type of information is found in public records and on the internet. So this seems to be a strong way to know history, and this gives him a certain authority. It makes his father seem a little bit naive. Um, the son demonstrates some awareness of the effects of propaganda. He talks about brainwashing um, and the effects of Stalin's repression. He talks about how one should believe their consciousness over patriotism, and he does this to challenge his father's uh, uncomplex or simple views of Stalin, one-dimensional views, I should say. But then, towards the end of the film, the son brings up this idea that Stalin was um, sort of given supernatural powers by a shaman and a witch, and this allowed him to avoid assassination attempts. Um, and again, he kind of supports this with with historical knowledge, but he's found saying things like, "It is said that the shaman, initiated him, being Stalin, with preternatural powers," and even the father pushes back and says, "Do you really believe what you're saying?" And the son says, "Well, you be the judge here." So he's by saying "you be the judge here," he's kind of refusing to ultimately make the claim that this is the case, but it's very clear that he believes that the shaman gave Stalin special powers, and he even believes that Stalin had this magical fur coat that seemed to protect him. At first, it may seem like the father and the son have very, very different views, and the film is presented to the viewer as a sort of debate. But after we kind of analyze the way that these two people approach historical knowledge, certain similarities in thought patterns arrive. Both the father and the son employ a kind of conspiratorial thinking, a circular logic. Circular logic is very common in conspiracy theories. Um, for example, the son believes that when Stalin survived these assassination attempts, it was because he was endowed with magical abilities by shamans and witches. And also, when he finally dies, he says, well, this was probably because this was the moment when the witch made it through his special psychic abilities and was finally able to kill him. So both evidence for and against his theory is interpreted as evidence in support of his theory. This is a sign of conspiratorial thinking. And the father thinks a similar way. For example, um, he believes that Russia needs a strong leader and that the Russian people are lazy. And this is because Russia always has had a strong leader in a sense, or there's no real counterfactual that he brings up. So everything can be used as evidence to support this claim, which is not really well founded. So why is it that they both employ this similar logic and end up in totally, it seems like they're arguing for different things, but they're arguing for them in actually somewhat similar ways. And my guess is that perhaps this is a result of surveillance, because under surveillance, when somebody's being watched constantly, they tend to develop a belief in the omnipotent. Um, and this effect of surveillance kind of perhaps it's transcending generations. The father lived most of his life after Stalin's death, of course, and yet he still seems to believe in kind of the omnipotence and omniscience of Stalin. The son, of course, doesn't believe in Stalin's omniscience and omnipotence in the same way, um, but we still see those underlying structures, that there has to be some type of special supernatural power to this figure. So that being said, what is the goal or the effect of this film? What is what is the are the writer and the director trying to say here? I think the answer to that question depends on our answer to a different question, which is, what is the film's genre? If we look at this film as a documentary film, um, and we take all of the historical takes and interpretations as serious, then the ultimate effect, I'm afraid, is that it kind of legitimizes Stalinist nostalgia, and it delegitimizes anti-Stalinism by portraying the anti-Stalinist or the realist when it comes to Stalinist repression as sort of a member of the occult who believes in these really quite out of the ordinary ideas. If we view the film as a historical fiction, or maybe a drama perhaps, a more interesting question arises. The film kind of questions our ability to to know history and to look at history in a sober way, or at least it questions um, multiple generations of Russians' ability to look at Stalin as just a historical figure, and our inability to resist his interpreting Stalin as some type of mystical or omnipotent figure. Perhaps what Stalin did was so monumental and so terrible and so terrifying that the state of the debate in contemporary Russia is is still needs to endow Stalin with either the um, supernatural powers which come from the cult of personality, or the supernatural powers which come literally from the occult. Either way, I believe that both views serve to uh, protect Stalin and insulate him from fully taking responsibility over his actions and over the crimes he committed, um, by giving him a supernatural and omniscient power. He kind of uh, is forgiven for his crimes, or at least his crimes are lessened by that. You know, it's almost as if it was out of his control because he had some great power that was acting through him. Um, and maybe the state of the debate is in a place where, at the moment, people feel the need for that kind of greater power in order to approach and digest this very, very difficult period.